players gather to cast powerful spells. Some of the oldest and most powerful in the history of Magic the Gathering. Patchwork Automaton, Invigorate, Sir Ginger Meal Ender, and many others. Battling head-to-head in brutal combat, they all have one thing in common: to uphold their legacy and the search for eternal glory.
The Eternal Glory podcast is brought to you by the minds behind BoshNRoll on YouTube, Thraben University, and theepicstorm.com. This episode is sponsored by 3-for-1 Trading and Sparks Law Practice.
Hello, and welcome to episode 121 of the Eternal Glory podcast, Opportunity Cost. We've already recorded 30 minutes of introduction and banter for the week, available in our supporter-exclusive pre-show. Check out patreon.com/eternalglory to gain access, or join as a YouTube member for the same content on YouTube instead. We've all got a pretty big announcement that's shared between the three of us, so make sure you join up and give it a listen. As always, I'm Phil Gallagher, aka ThrabenU.
I'm Brian Coval, aka BoshNRoll.
And I'm Brian Cook of the Epic Storm.
Shout out to our new members since the last episode who are going to get that big announcement and other stuff. We've got Midna Light, Andreas R., Austin M., Stang. Shout out to Stang. Bring your twin. I was a big fan of Stang back in the day. I always said that's got a Stang every time I attacked with it. And Nick. Shout out to all those new members.
This episode is brought to you by Sparks Law, a business transactional law firm owned by Eternal Magic community member Jonathan Sparks. If you're an entrepreneur, business owner, or gig worker looking to start your own company, Sparks Law can help with partnership agreements, contract reviews, intellectual property protection, or any other business legal questions. If you want to shape your business strategy with a fellow Eternal gamer, reach out via email to jsparks, that's JSPARKS, at sparkslawpractice.com, or call 470-268-5234. This episode is also sponsored by 3-for-1 Trading, one of Europe's leading Magic the Gathering traders. Their online shop has a fantastic selection of high-end Magic cards, especially for vintage, legacy, and old school players. You can find them at shop.3for1trading.com or visit their booth at major events. They run weekly sales, and new, individually scanned high-end cards are added every Wednesday. Use code EternalGlory to get our community-exclusive offer of free worldwide shipping on your first order over $500 and experience their world-class customer service and exact grading for yourself.
And if you want to advertise to over 10,000 Eternal gamers every single episode, reach out to us. We're always accepting new sponsors. And with that, this week's episode is on opportunity costs within deck building, and I would like to shout out a good friend of mine, Alex McKinley, who happened to write a similar article for the Epic Storm this past week, and it came up over a really terrific conversation in the Storm Discord within the Commander section, where some players didn't understand the value of playing Surveil lands in a high-speed competitive format. Well, lands come into play tapped, what if you draw one? And it's sort of what sparked this discussion. We're going to dive into that in this very episode.
Yep, shout out to Alex. I had many conversations with this subject on my mind, and then I saw it pop up that Alex wrote an article on exactly this thing as well, so it's clearly out there, and it's a good topic. We are talking about deck building here, which is one of the core aspects of Magic the Gathering. You don't have to be a deck builder to play Magic. You can copy a deck and be a really good player. There was a very long time in my Magic career where I was not building decks. I was just taking decks that were winning in other people's hands and understanding how they worked and maybe change a sideboard card or something. But it was really not until I launched the channel that I was actually building decks from the ground up for high power formats. What are your histories with deck building? Obviously, Brian, you have a entire website built on a deck that you constructed over many years. So let's start with that.
I started by finding other decks in other formats that I really liked. Like, I know that I'm like the Storm guy now, but for years I was the Rugged Threshold kid. I played Magma Jets in my Tempo deck, and people are like, but those don't even cantrip. And I was just like, yeah, but they work for me. And I probably wasn't right. But over time, I learned a lot through deck building and trying out different things. And experimenting is always good. And I think that you just have to try something that's out there, but also know when your experiment has failed. And that's a crucial part of deck building.
I think on my end, I didn't consider myself a deck builder really until I started the YouTube channel and started doing Twitch streaming, I considered myself a tuner. You know, I was someone who was futzing with various like Red Prison, Moonstompy, Death and Taxes decks in that general wheelhouse. And I could tell you what the flex slots were supposed to be at any given time and why, but it was very, very rare that I would build something from scratch and take it to a weekly or something like that. I was doing so much more adjustment than building from the start. And for a long time, if you ask me like, how many lands are supposed to be in this deck? How many removal spells do you need? You know, what does your blue count need to be for this Force of Will? You know, I couldn't answer those questions for a very, very long time.
Yep, agreed. We're not really talking about how land counts and blue counts and stuff today, at least not directly. We're talking about opportunity cost in deck building, which the thing that prompted this for me is the YouTube comments always. So many YouTube comments are like, what about Arbor Elf? Or did you think about Path to Exile? And it like with no additional information, just like, what about blank random card? My thought to that is always like, well, what about it? What does it do that our deck needs done? What are you cutting that this card is better than? And the idea of just proposing a magic card that exists for a deck that's in front of you without fully thinking about everything that it would mean to put that card into that deck, that's kind of what we're going into today.
So we're going to start with kind of some general deck building stuff, and probably about at the halfway point of the episode, we're really going to zero in on opportunity costs. So let's start with kind of the biggest question that goes into deck building. And it's a simple one. What is your plan? What is your game plan?
Yeah, what's your deck supposed to do? And the way that I help people think about this in my coaching is I ask them what the last turn of the game looks like. Like, what does a winning board state look like when your opponent concedes or their life total becomes 0? What does a losing board state look like when you concede or your life total becomes 0? And then from there, we can figure out how to make that happen. Like, does the game look like you have a Dragon's Rage Channeler and a Delver of Secrets and Force of Will in your hand? Or does the game look like your opponent has 7 cards in their hand and they're just dead to Caves of Chaos Adventure that you played on turn 1 and they don't have time to empty those hands? Is their hand empty? Are they just dead before they can empty their hand? Like, all of these things are included in what does the last turn of the game look like? And then I kind of like to work backwards to fill in how are we going to make that happen?
That's interesting. So in tutoring sessions, at least from the combo perspective, I always like to ask people like, well, how do you envision the first few turns of this game going? And have them explain to me. And then we discuss different avenues to what our opponent might be doing and the best way to get to the avenue that they want to. So it's almost like we work in completely different ways.
I think that the implication in your example is already the answer to my question. Like, if someone comes to you and says like, I built this deck around creative technique, and then you like, okay, so like you're trying to like cascade your way into eventually an Emrakul, and then you take an extra turn with a giant board. Okay, so what do the first few turns of the game look like? How do we develop this? I feel like my question is already in your question, especially if someone tells you what their deck's trying to do when they come to you for help. Is that reasonable? Am I off base?
That sounds about right. Yeah.
All right, so that question's in there too.
So I think a fundamental difference in deck building is like when you ask this question to a new Magic player, they will respond with something like, I built a blue deck. I built a flyer deck. I built an elf deck. And they're not so much focused on the plan and what actually happens. They're focusing around a theme. And I feel like a lot of times people who are trying to brew and get cute with things are focusing on the theme rather than on the plan. So, and I'll probably use this for another example later. Someone submitted a deck for me to play that I'm currently tuning that was essentially a Yorion Blink deck. They called it like Fun with Portals, and everything in the deck blinks something. Your Teferis, Flicker Wisps, Touch the Spirit Realms. And it is meant to be kind of this end game, I'm going to bury you in card advantage from all these 2-for-1 blink interactions. And the deck had, I think, 0 counter spells, 0 hard removal spells, no way to actually permanently stop what the opponent was doing. And so, like, how do you get to that point where you actually get to blink all your things and bury your opponent in golem tokens off Blade Splicer? And the answer is, like, you don't, the way that you have built that deck. You don't have a plan to get to your end game.
Right. And when you started that line of talk about like, I built a blue deck, I built an elf deck, I kind of thought at first, like, I think our listeners are past that. But no, you're right, they're not. The idea of I built an elf deck. It's just all the elves I own in a bunch of forests. We were all that gamer once. Or I built a direct damage deck. It's every red spell I own and all the mountains I own in a pile of 100 cards. I built that deck too. That's actually not that far removed from like, I built this blink deck, like your example, where it's like, the idea is just, I have a bunch of things that blink and a bunch of things worth blinking and then some lands to cast them. That is only slightly better than I built an elf deck.
Yeah, Phil, honestly, I was kind of offended. As the guy who likes to cycle in Pauper, I have the cycling deck, and I was just like, Phil's just like attacking me right now. All I want to do is cycle my cards, and here he is just like digging at me. On a something related note, something that comes up a lot in the YouTube comments is like, oh, well, when you cast Songs of the Damned, you often make 20 mana. Why don't you play a Consume Spirit? Like, that comes up so often, and I think it's a pretty big example here of, like, what is the plan? How do you envision this game ending? That sort of, these, like, overall general questions about deck strategy, where it seems like the perfect answer, because, like, oh, well, you have 20 black mana, why wouldn't you just play Consume Spirit? But in a world where you're actually playing the games, Consume Spirit, you draw into it, and you're like, oh, I don't have 20 black mana right now, this card does nothing. And those are the examples that I think get people to that next level where you're then teaching them, oh, well, this is a clean answer when you've already won the game. Well, what about a way to win that is also useful while you're trying to win the game, gets them to that next understanding? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
I just was reminded of this great thread this week that will underpin this episode and anyone who ever watches our content ever again, or any content. Jean-Emmanuel Dupre, who I believe is the reigning Magic World Champion. If he's not currently reigning, he won the year before. I think he's the current reigning Magic World Champion. He had a thread based specifically in terms of Magic content. He was trying to reconcile the fact that people come to your content because they see you as an expert in something, and then they're also very quick to confidently tell you how you're wrong about a bunch of things, rather than taking the time to understand that if you did something different than they would do, why they might want to reconsider their process, rather than telling you how wrong you are right away. Like, you wouldn't watch someone you don't think is good, at least, unless they're really funny or something, I guess. There could be reasons to do that. But if you come to a strategy content venue and the person does something different than you, and your knee jerk is to write in the comments how stupid they are, instead of reflect on, wait, why might they do that way? And what am I doing wrong that this expert is doing it this way and not my way? I think that just sort of flows behind everything that we do, and this deck building, and like, we're going to cite YouTube comments a lot of like, well, what about Consume Spirit? Why don't you work backwards and understand why I don't put Consume Spirit in my deck? That I just think that that's worth saying out loud. I thought that was a really great thread that resonated with me very closely.
I thought you were going to mention the comments from that thread on there, where somebody purposely calls out watching Paulo Vitor Dama de Rosa, arguably the greatest Magic player of all time, if it's not John Finkel, but honestly, it might be Paulo in my opinion. And they're just like, I watch Paulo play, and none of his plays make any sense. I think he's just terrible and gets lucky and draws the cards he needs. And like, those are the comments that people leave, and I'm just like, how do you watch Paulo, who's like, you know, this phenomenal player who went on such a terrific run in the modern era, and just go, I think he's just lucky and draws what he needs. Like, you realize how many times Paulo has to be that lucky and draw that many good outs in order for that to be true? No, he's running circles around you. That's how good he is.
When I get comments like that, it's frequently when I could force of will a Chalice of the Void, but I don't. And then I lose like 16 turns later after forcing the threat and giving myself 16 turns to draw an out. And then I just whiff on Leyline Bindings and Prismatic Endings and Teferis and anything that could answer that Chalice. And then someone's like, no, you lost that game the second you didn't force Chalice. It's comments like that where it's like, okay, sure. I've made a successful legacy career in letting Chalice of the Void resolve and answering it 1-for-1 in better ways than Force of Will. Go off, King. I didn't want to derail the whole conversation here. I just thought that it's because we're going to be giving a lot of advice, and this is from a place of expertise, and people are listening to the pod because they want to hear what we have to say. It just felt appropriate to bring up that thread before we really dive into the meat here.
Brian, let's use that example of not Force of Willing the Chalice of the Void. And something that I often do when I'm playing a Storm deck is think, what is my opponent's game plan against me? If their plan is to play Chalice of the Void backed by a creature, and my hand either does one of two things. It's either ready to go and I need to answer that Chalice of the Void, or I need to buy time. And if I need to buy time, killing the threat is the answer, because I might have another answer to Chalice of the Void in hand, but I don't have the mana or the tutor yet. And I think instead of just always thinking, well, obviously you answered the Chalice, you should be asking bigger picture questions on what does a winning game look like from here? What is my opponent trying to do to me? And these are the sort of things that will get you further. Like you mentioned, having 16 looks at finding cards that do X, Y, or Z, instead of just obviously making the play to always answer the Chalice, because that's not correct all the time. It might be correct 80% of the time, but you might have been in a situation where the 20% was, the choice here.
And that goes back to my fundamental question that I always ask people, both in deck building and in when they're playing out a game. What does the last turn of this game look like? The last turn of the game, in that case, like if I'm a blue deck versus a prison deck, the last turn of the game looks like they either don't have prison pieces or they're not actually locking out what my spells are, and I am pushing damage. The last turn of the game where I lose is there's a Force of Will in my graveyard, no cards in my hand, and I'm getting clapped by a Rabble Master next turn. That's what I'm worried about at this moment. Or they have the initiative, and it doesn't matter if there's a Chalice in play or a Force in my hand or what, because the initiative is cranking.
All right, so let's say that you've made your plan. I think one of the next fundamental things is, how do you find your plan? And a lot of times in Legacy, given the high power of that format, the answer is tutors, cantrips, raw card draw. But some decks don't have those things, and the answer is mulligan aggressively. Like, you need to know, how am I going to consistently make this plan work? Because consistency is key for any deck that you really want to take seriously and bring to a tournament.
Phil, you just highlighted a huge thing for me. And in my videos, I often say the phrase, and I swear I do it all the time, leverage the London mulligan. Don't be afraid to mulligan. And you know what my comment sections often say?
You mulligan too much.
Mulligan's too much. It's like, yeah, if my deck is based around this one card or a few cards, I need to take as many looks as possible to finding that card. And keeping a hand that is 3 lands plus 4 cards that I can cast is a choice. It might not actually get me any closer to winning this game.
I have the best possible example of this. I yelled at the screen when I saw the hand that my opponent kept. I'm playing a grief deck. My opponent knows this. They kept a hand of 4 soul lands, a Timeless Dragon, an Anointed Peacekeeper, and a Fable of the Mirrorbreaker. And I griefed them on turn 1 on the play. And I was just like, why did you not mulligan? The London mulligan is the strongest thing that exists in Magic. And I just griefed their Timeless Dragon, and they did not cast a spell for the rest of that game, I think. It is wild to me how people are so reluctant to just use the power of the London mulligan. Like, especially when you're doing something that can effectively win the game in the first 2 turns, like so many Legacy decks can. Like, please use it, folks.
I have a theory here, and you both could tell me that I'm wrong, but for people that enjoy Legacy, they've likely been around long enough to remember the Paris mulligan, and in my head, that was the de facto mulligan rule of Magic, because that's what was the rule when I started. So you would just draw your 7, and if you didn't like it, you would ship it back and draw 6. That was it. And I feel like, looking back on old tournament reports, I would keep a lot of terrible hands, because the rule at the time was, well, it's got to be better than 6, right? Like, you just never wanted a mulligan because you're incredibly punished for every mulligan, I guess is my point here. And then with the Vancouver, it got a little bit, not as bad. And now with the London, sometimes you're just extremely rewarded for mulliganing and how much it's changed. So do you think other Legacy players out there remember the Paris like I do, and they're just like, I'm never mulliganing. Why would I do that?
So on the contrary, I mean, we have Stompy Guy and Storm Guy here talking about the London mulligan, and then you got Island Ponder Keep Guy over here. I mean, I'll keep any hand that casts Ponder. That's not one of us being wrong or 2 of us being wrong, which is much more likely, if I'm being honest. It's answering the question, how will you find your plan? How will you execute your plan? If your deck is built on a high land count, a bunch of Ponders, Brainstorms, Lorien Revealed, etc., I am happy to keep a 1-lander and let the cards come as they will. Because if your plan is to, like, circle back, what does the last turn of the game look like? And then more specifically, when is the last turn of the game? Is it turn 3 in the case of Initiative or Storm, or even turn 1 or 2 in the case of Storm? Or is it turn 11 when you finally escape that Uro and start beating down? Because if your last turn of the game, by design, is turn 10 plus, you don't really care what your opening hand looks like as long as it has interaction and sees more cards, because you can't make your whole game plan based on your opening 7 in a deck like that. So how do you find your plan? That varies based on what the deck's actually trying to do.
So our next big question here is, how will you cast your spells? And within the context of Legacy, oftentimes this means on cheating in mana in some way, be that with Ancient Tomb, Dark Ritual, Artifact, mana. There's a lot of ways to do that. So physically, how are you going to cast your spells, especially your more expensive spells? And to a lesser extent, this is also where things like mana-based construction starts to come in.
Yep, and I just mentioned Lorien Revealed, Ponder, Brainstorm. I mean, Lorien Revealed is more obvious than Ponder and Brainstorm, but people coming into formats with cantrips, coming in from Standard where you don't really get those, and then Pioneer is stuff like Consider and Opt, Modern gets Preordain, and then by the time you get to Legacy, Ponder and Brainstorm, that's part of your mana base when you're getting set up, and it's part of your spell base when you're cashing out. So how do you cast your spells? The answer in the case of the decks I like to build is look at lots of cards. They will be some amount of lands and some amount of spells, and then you can put away the things you don't want at the times where you don't want them.
If you go all the way back to the rise of Star City Games Legacy coverage, I specifically remember watching a lot of Stoneblade mirrors. And at the time, Vendilion Clique was a huge card, Natural Order was a big card. At that time period, 23 lands was pretty stock in most blue decks. If you were a Delver Secret strategy, you typically played 18 or 19, but if you were a Stoneblade deck, 23 was the number. And oftentimes it included things like Riptide Laboratory, because you gotta bounce your Snapcasters and your Vendilion Cliques, right? And at that time period, Ponder was not a card people really played. Like, you might have seen one or two here or there, but it wasn't until the rise of Miracles that people figured out that you just want to be on 4 all the time. And to Brian's point, what was cut? Riptide Laboratory and cards like that. All those cute utility lands sort of went out the window, and we saw land counts lower to the point where Miracles was 21 fairly consistently. So is it 1-for-1 with lands? Probably not, but I think Ponder does represent at least a fraction of a land.
Yeah, so a really important thing here, and this is a term that I've seen in a lot of the stuff you've worked with, Bryant, is initial mana source. Initial mana sources and mana sources are not the same thing. So let's use Lorien Revealed or Troll of Khazad-dûm as an example. In order for those to generate mana, you need the first land to start things off. I think it was a Reddit post earlier today that I was looking at that someone had 14 lands in their deck list with a bunch of like trolls. And if you can't cycle that troll does not actually represent any mana in your mana base. If you get too greedy with cutting too many lands, your cantrips and similar cards aren't actually going to get you the mana that you need.
Right. And in the Lorien Revealed Troll of Khazad-dûm era we're in now, we're seeing the cheatiest land counts we've seen in a long time among decks that do intend to cast spells. There have always been 0, 1, 2 land kind of decks that could exist in the Legacy card pool, but like Brian said, Delver decks 18 or 19 land. Rescaminator plays 16 or 17, and in my experience playing that deck, the hands that you mulligan are ones that are like 2 Troll of Khazad-dûm, no way to get it rolling. And I just recorded a video yesterday where 3 of my 5 opponents led off in game 1 with Wasteland Go, which is just really not something that would have happened before you could cycle for a colorless and get colored mana. So then we got to consider, let's move on to the next topic here, which we've already alluded to a little bit. What might your opponent's plan be? And this is also known as metagaming. And Phil mentioned this with that Blink deck as the example. And I'm going to bring up a recent example from my coaching as well. And shout out to this coaching client if they're listening. Understand this from a place of love. But they had a Tainted Remedy deck that's 2 and a black enchantment. If an opponent would gain life, that player loses that much life instead. And they had Beacon of Immortality in this deck. Double target player's life total. That's a one-shot kill with Tainted Remedy. However, the rest of the deck was just like life gain cards, like Hero's Reunion and Rest for the Weary, and stuff like Abundant Growth that could cantrip to maybe find some stuff. And then the deck had Sterling Groves to tutor the Tainted Remedy. And then I was like, okay, so your plan is to resolve a 3-drop and then a 6-drop with no real plan to survive that long other than gaining life. And this person was like, well, the Sterling Grove can protect the Tainted Remedy. And I said, well, not if you sacrifice it to tutor for the Tainted Remedy. And the point is that no opponent is going to let you do everything that you want to do. And even if an opponent has a deck with no interaction at all, if the thing that you want to do relies on resolving a 3-drop and then resolving a different 6-drop, your deck can't actually win until turn 6. And if your opponent has no interaction of their own, it's probably because they're shoving a win. That's going to happen before turn 6. This deck had a lot of problems. You should build your decks assuming that there will be some exchange of resources. They play a thing, you remove it. You play a thing, they remove it. There's a counterspell, there's this, there's that. And then once the dust settles and both of you have spent some cards on stuff, that you could start revealing what your deck's actually about or stick the next thing. And I proposed maybe we make this an Enchantress deck, because the Tainted Remedy is an enchantment. Sterling Grove is a card for Enchantress. If you put Enchantress's Presence and Sithis Harvest Hand into this deck, now you're cantripping while you're setting up, and your cards will keep flowing. And you could still play Beacon of Immortality and Tainted Remedy, but then you have a coherent deck that can do other stuff along the way. And that immediately just unlocked. I actually opened up the Moxfield link as I was talking about this, and I see that he's been in there. There's a bunch of Enchantress cards in this deck now, so shout out to that. We're moving in the right direction on that one. So you have to imagine that you have an opponent and that they will make decisions at some point in the game. Your deck cannot simply be, this is what my cards are, and I hope they work.
And sometimes you maybe even need to do more than one thing. And so you need to start asking yourself, does my deck have a secondary plan, or does it need a secondary plan? And we have one of the best examples of this maybe ever in Legacy with the current Riscaminator deck list, where they are essentially a tempo deck list that can just, oops, I drew Entomb and here's an Atraxa. A lot of times there is a real cost to having a secondary plan, because that's going to eat up a lot of your cards in your deck list.
Right. And one of the things that has become more clear in the few weeks or month or so at this point that Riscaminator's been in the format is that deck doesn't play removal. It can't. Other than triggering Archon of Cruelty, maybe they have a Brazen Borrower, but all these slots, the 4 Entombs, 2 Monsters, 4 Animate Deads, those are at the expense of cards like Fatal Push. And if you do something like stick an Elvish Reclaimer and then hold up 2 mana for Bojuka Bog or whatever else you'd like to get for the rest of the game, that deck really struggles against that plan. So even a secondary plan in a tried and true deck that is very good at using it still comes at significant cost.
Wow, opportunity cost is crazy. And from a combo player perspective, a lot of people come to me with ideas of like, I have this A plus B idea. And I'm like, okay, well, that's interesting. What happens if your opponent removes the B? And they're like, oh, well, my deck doesn't really do anything. And having a backup plan is incredibly good in Legacy combo decks and really just combo decks in general. And it's even better when your C works with your A and B. So, for example, let's say you're a Past in Flames combo deck. You want to have a plan B that doesn't use the graveyard because your plan A is graveyard centric. Remember that you want something that is on plan with your theme, but also different enough that the cards that your opponents are trying to use to beat you, remember what your opponent might be doing, don't affect your secondary plan. So you'd want something that doesn't use the graveyard, like Ad Nauseam, the classic Ant example.
And I think one of our final big questions here is, how are people going to react to your plan? And does your deck building take that into account? And a lot of times in playing like various brews, I will see something like, in game 1, I'm a Painter deck. And in game 2, I'm a Leyline Helm deck. Well, your opponent saw Painter and is going to board in their Null Rods and Force of Vigors and things of that nature. And the Helms and the Leyline are still going to be affected by those cards. So if you're not considering how your opponent is going to react to what they see in game 1 in your deck building, you're doing yourself a massive disservice.
Right. And this is another masterwork of Riscaminator, where they reanimate you in game 1 and then they just juke off of that and have a bunch of creatures game 2. Contrary to that, I have seen builds of like lands that pivot onto Uro, which is another thing that goes out of the graveyard. And if your Life from the Loam deck is pivoting onto Uro Titan of Nature's Wrath, the hate that people bring in are still going to hit it. Understanding that is really important. You need a plan to either do something different or bust through it.
It's really unfortunate that the Sloth isn't on Magic Online, because I think that card is the perfect card for what you're trying to describe, Brian, where you don't want to use the graveyard, but if you have the giant sloth from Fallout on Magic Online, you just get this massive creature that interacts similarly, but in a different way. So that would be a great example here.
And I think kind of the last thing that I want to add on this note is that a lot of times when I'm playing some brew, about halfway through the league, I will realize that I am fully dead to X thing because my deck just purely cannot answer it. You know, maybe it'll be something random like, oh, I have 0 outs to an ensnaring bridge. That's not something that I was expecting to play against in this metagame. And so, like, taking into account what are the things that you are just going to be stone cold dead to, is it worth it, or can you easily slot in an answer to that thing at a low opportunity cost? That is going to kind of lead into some of the stuff that we're going to be talking about in the next section here.
It's funny because Ensnaring Bridge is exactly the card I had in mind when I read that note that you put in. That is exactly the type of card that might be in a Karn Wishboard. It might be in like a Goblin Welder toolbox. And it's like, yep, ice cold to that next game.
So why don't we go ahead and zero in on opportunity cost as a concept now? And I think in understanding the opportunity cost of playing a card, you need to be thinking about the floor of the card. That is the worst it will possibly be, not just focus on the ceiling of the card. That is, how good can it possibly be in the perfect magical Christmas land scenarios?
Yeah, I'm going to start this off by firing a confession out there into the world. When Opposition Agent was spoiled, I got really excited and I tweeted, the floor on this thing is Frenzied Tilling. PVDH replied, the floor on this thing is 3/2 Flash. And I was like, oh shit, now I feel stupid. And it turns out that 3/2 Flash is a lot worse than Frenzied Tilling. And Opposition Agent has not become the legacy staple that I was worried it might off the spoiler, because I didn't find the floor. I found like the worst thing you could snag with an Opposition Agent if your opponent plays into it. I did not find the actual floor of that card right away.
There's a spoiler from Outlaws of Thunder Junction. I don't remember the name of it. It's 2 colorless and a blue. And if you cast an artifact that costs 3 or more mana, you get to make essentially an Urza Saga Construct token. And someone in my Discord posted that, and someone else just responded, legacy decks don't want a card whose floor is 2 and a blue to scry 2. And I just thought that was just like absolute perfect timing for this episode, where, you know, some people were getting really excited about what this card is capable of doing. You know, you've cast it, you know, your thought monitors start doing cool things, and it's like, no, you know, the floor of this card is so incredibly low that the ceiling is probably not even worth discussing.
Right. And floor and ceiling in deck building and card selection is the other thing that I really hammer on my coaching clients. Is, to me, it is more important to me to keep hands more often than it is to nut draw more often. And by that, I mean, if I'm mulling a lands and spells hand of 7, then I'm mulling a lands and spells hand of 6, and then I find a 5 that can, you know, really just go for it. Obviously, this is a little different for Initiative or Storm. We just had this use the London Mulligan versus keep your hands with Ponder in them conversation. But it is more important for you to be able to play the game more often than it is for you to win in some dramatic fashion more often. If you win through nuts and bolts Magic the Gathering gameplay some amount of the time, and then your deck does the very cool thing 1 out of 20 or 30 games, and you're winning, you know, 17 to 20 of those games, it's more important than winning 5 of those games and you pop on turn 1 in those 5. So I always raise if I have a choice between 2 cards where one makes my nut draw better and one makes my worst draw better, I'm going to make my worst draw better.
A card that I think a lot about in terms of floor is Brazen Borrower. Like, I feel like Brazen Borrower is just this deck building band-aid where, like, I have a problem, just like slap 2 Brazen Borrowers into the sideboard and it just fixes your problem. The floor of that card is so incredibly high. It is a 3 power creature with evasion. That's great. It is a generic temporary answer to just about everything. That's great. And you don't think about the highest upsides in deck building where it's like, oh, this can stop me from death from this 2020 token. Brazen Borrower is an awesome, like, very high floor card. Is it the most efficient threat in the world? No. Is it the most efficient and permanent removal spell in the world? No. But it's really good at what it does.
Right. And Brazen Borrower is a great example because we're talking about Brazen Borrower where it bounces one thing one time. Like, what about Echoing Truth? That could wipe out any number of Saga tokens. It could clear a whole board of Knight of the Reliquaries or multiple Chalices, or Hurkyl's Recall can just break open against a prison deck of some kind. None of those cards ever attack for 3 if there's nothing worth bouncing. And finding out where the floor is, and the floor of a bounce spell in your sideboard is, what if there's nothing to bounce? And Brazen Borrower beautifully solves that by bringing the beats if there's nothing to bounce.
There was a card previewed today, Pest Control, from Outlaws at Thunder Junction, where for a white and a black, you destroy all non-land permanents with mana value 1 or less, or you can cycle it for 2 mana. And at first, I had to reread the card because I couldn't believe it was real. I thought that the top half of that card was legitimate. I was, there's no way this thing just cycles for 2. The opportunity cost of playing this in your deck is so low, because if it's ever not live, you just cycle it for 2 mana. It's such a small cost. And the upside is you're going to completely blow out some opponents in Legacy for a mere 2 mana. And on top of that, it exiles the Chrome Mox, Grief, Solitude. I mean, cards like this, where the downside is you just draw another card, are incredible.
Yep, and that brings me to one of my favorite cards the last few years, Dress Down. That's another Band-Aid that you can imagine a blowout where you just sweep up a bunch of Construct tokens, or you stuff a ETB trigger, you like stuff a Yorion, and then they don't get anything. And then plenty of time, you just cast it for 2, and now it's a different card. Cycling or cantripping are the ultimate opportunity cost replacers, because the card that can draw a card, if the card is bad, is always better than the card that does not do that with a similar effect.
And I think another really important thing to understand here is that the floor of a card can massively change based on the metagame. And I've chosen Spirit of the Labyrinth as my example here. When Spirit of the Labyrinth came out, I was super excited about it. And then I played it into a world of Tarmogoyfs, where my Spirit of the Labyrinth was just getting lightning bolted and was growing a Tarmogoyf by 2. And Spirit of the Labyrinth was actually losing me way more games than it was winning me at that time. And then we fast forward 6 months, the next set comes out. This card called Treasure Cruise starts getting really popular. And all of a sudden, the floor on Spirit of the Labyrinth became a lot higher because Goyf was disappearing. Blue-red tempo decks were becoming much more popular. And I became very, infatuated with Spirit of the Labyrinth. And we look at the current metagame where Orcish Bowmasters is 40% of the metagame, and you've got to be crazy to be playing X1 creatures. And once again, that card's evaluation has totally shifted.
Yep, that's a great look over time at the cost of a card. The Spirit of the Lab growing Goyf by 2 is really funny. Just thinking about that perspective from the olden times when those were cards we could play.
Yeah, I can vividly remember an SCG event where I was just staring down 2 Tarmogoyfs looking at the Spirit of the Labyrinth in my hand, and I was just like, can I even play this, or am I going to die if I do?
Yeah, those were the days we're giving Rug Delver one of I always called them the weird ones. Like, there was the 4 instant creature land sorcery. Those were the normal ones. And then I was like, are there any weird ones in the graveyard? And putting an enchantment in there for Rug Delver is always a spew.
The next topic is one that I'm pretty passionate about, and it's the fact that deck space is limited. Every card you play is at the cost of another card you didn't play instead. To start this episode, Brian talked about, what about Path to Exile? It's like, well, what is Path to Exile better than? And it comes up a lot for me because I often play decks with wish boards. So in theory, to Phil's example of losing to Ensnaring Bridge, if you're willing to play a card to answer Ensnaring Bridge in your sideboard and you're a wish player like I am, and that could be Burning Wish, Cunning Wish, or even, and I regret saying this out loud, Karn the Great Creator, you could have answers to anything you want. But is it worth it? How often will that answer in your sideboard be Ensnaring Bridge? Is that deck slot going to be relevant? And it's a question that I'm always asking people when they're like, well, what about this in your sideboard? It's like, I could play a card that answers the One Ring, but according to data, the One Ring is in less than 2% of decks nowadays. Do I want to play a dedicated card on my sideboard to beat the One Ring? Do you believe that's worth it? And a lot of the times I don't get responses back. And I think that's because I'm helping shine the light on why, deck space is limited and why those cards aren't always perfect.
I think another really good example here is the old like Death and Taxes versus Glimpse of Nature Elves matchup. That matchup was just so tough that it literally mathematically was not worth it to try to fix the matchup, because the cost of fixing that matchup, which was still going to be incredibly tough even if you tried to fix it, was your other matchups just becoming much worse across the board. It's okay to select to lose to something.
Yeah, and Bryant said that every card you play is at the cost of a card that you didn't play. And I want to expand that to it's at the cost of every card you didn't play. Like if you choose to put a card in your deck, that is a slot that could have been any other legal card in that format. You really have to make sure you know what you're doing with that. Like a cute card, the word cute has been said a few times in this podcast, and I want people to understand that cute is always derogatory when we're talking about Magic decks. Cute is not good. You don't want cute cards. It is a nice way to say this is a wasted slot on an interaction that will not come up very often. A cute card isn't just like, oh, I'll just throw it in there, and if I happen to draw it when things are going well, it's going to be a lot of fun. You are going to draw it sometimes when things are not going well, and then it's a blank. And if things are already going well, what do you need this card for? I literally replace it with Preordain at random, and your deck's probably better, whatever this card you're thinking about is.
The narrower the card that you're playing is, the lower percentage of the time you are actually going to do the cool thing that you are thinking about. So a lot of times in Magic, we refer to, if you need two things to kind of do your combo or whatever, that's an A plus B. And a lot of times these cute cards start getting into A plus B plus C territory, where you need three things to line up in order for it to execute its thing. And a lot of times, that C, that third card, is not going to do anything without the other two.
Right. And I have two recent examples, one good, one bad, that came up from my channel. One of them is I played a Forensic Gadgeteer deck. It's a 3 mana, I think 2/3, that when you cast an artifact, you get a clue, and artifacts cost 1 less to activate. And somebody said in the comments, what about Shadowblood Egg? It's free if you have Gadgeteer. And Shadowblood Egg is a 1 mana artifact that for 2 mana, you could sack for a blue and a black mana, and you draw a card. So Gadgeteer would reduce the sack cost to 2, which means I've spent 2 to get 2 and draw a card, kind of a build your own Manamorphose. And I read that comment, and shout out to that person if you're listening. I don't mean to be rude, but I was like, why would I want this card? What problem does it solve? It's only a card I'm even interested in if I already have stuck the namesake engine of my deck. The point of the deck was to get Forensic Gadgeteer with Basalt Monolith and get infinite mana. Why do I need to cast a blue-black Manamorphose if I've already resolved the core engine of my deck, which is a 3-drop in Legacy, which I assume that my opponents will answer somehow. It's dies to Plow, dies to Bolt, dies to Pyroblast, gets dazed pretty easily because it's a 3-drop. Like, just imagining all the worlds where I just have to cast a Shadowblood Egg and pass the turn versus like cycling for air quotes free. And when I built that deck, because that was one that I brewed from the ground up, deck slots were hard. Like, I wasn't sure if I could support Emery. I wasn't sure how many Thoughtcasts belong in that deck. Like, how many Monoliths do I play? How many win cons can I play? What's the bridge between if I don't have a Gadgeteer in play? And just the idea of making room for Shadowblood Egg, it haunted my dreams, honestly, to hear that said. That's just a huge lack of understanding of opportunity cost, while seeing an interaction that is kind of cool. And, sure, it is cool. Having a blue-black Manamorphose is cool, but the things that require for it to work that way, and then what you get out of it, even if it does, are basically nothing. And a contrary example is just today, at the time of recording, I released Mono Green Devotion in Modern on the channel. List that I was sent had 4 Llanowar Elf and 4 Delighted Halfling. And Delighted Halfling does not cast Archdruid's Charm on turn 2. So I turned Delighted Halfling into Elvish Mystic, and I was very proud of myself for that discovery. And then the comments immediately pointed out that Arbor Elf is probably better than Llanowar Elf anyway, because the deck is It's all forests, and then there's like 2 Besagers and 4 Nykthos. It is a Leyline of the Guild Pack deck, which means that sometimes Nykthos is a forest. And it's a Utopia Sprawl deck, which means sometimes I'll just turn to a One Ring with no help at all through an Arbor Elf. I found out very quickly that Delighted Halfling was wrong, but didn't make it all the way to the best thing, which was actually Arbor Elf.
So I think next I want to talk about like A plus B versus A plus B plus C deck building. The more slots your deck requires to execute its primary game plan, the fewer slots you have for interaction, protection, and flexibility. Like a lot of times, like you will see control decks that have very few win conditions because the entire deck is built around cantripping, stopping things, and your 2 copy of 4th Aerlingas and your 2 Triumph of St. Catherine's, maybe a Murktide Regent, that's enough win conditions. Whereas if you're playing an A plus B plus C combo deck, maybe you have 8 copies of A, 8 copies of B, 6 copies of C or something like that. And like it is very clear the difference in the number of cards you are dedicated to actually winning the game.
Phil, to go back to my Consumed Spirit example from earlier on in this episode, that is a perfect example here of A plus B plus C, where in this example, Consumed Spirit is the C. When you look at a deck like Cycle Storm, you're Reaping the Graves plus Songs of the Damned, and one of the cards you play in that deck is just a creature that cycles. But later on, it is your win condition. It is a part of the core engine, so you go from needing 2 cards to now needing 3 with Consumed Spirit, which is a singular card that you could use to win the game. But if you can reduce the number of cards you need, you can gain other options, like playing a tutor in your combo deck, for example, that will raise consistency, that allows you to find your A plus B instead of taking up a slot for a card you maybe didn't need. And that comes up a lot, not just in Pauper, but in Legacy too. Any way that you can reduce the amount of something else you need greatly improves your deck. So to relate this to the Epic Storm, when Beseech the Mirror was printed, we were like, okay, we're going to still keep playing Rite of Flame. And I apologize to Brian, but he recorded with one of those initial lists that still had Rite of Flame in it. And eventually we realized with Beseech the Mirror, you need way less mana to win the game. So we were like, okay, well, we can cut Rite of Flame then, and we'll add in 2 Thoughtseize and 2 Cabal Ritual. Cabal Ritual helps cast Beseech the Mirror, but we also don't need so much mana, so we'll add in a couple additional protection spells. And that's the start of the list that I played at Eternal Weekend. Brian just happened to be a week too early.
When you are on the cutting edge of deck building, you are going to have more failures than successes, probably by an order of magnitude. You are going to make mistakes. You are going to try things that don't work. As long as you keep learning from those mistakes, you are doing a very good thing. I want to use PVDH as an example here. Peter Vanderham has just absolutely wild deck lists all the time, often utilizing interesting mechanics that hit paper, things like attractions. And I imagine that a lot of the decks he builds that, don't make it to the Twitter posts are absolutely terrible. You do end up with some bangers every now and then when you keep iterating and testing these new things. And I've really enjoyed a lot of his deck lists that I've actually played on my channel once you get to the ones that have put in the work to tune them properly.
Yep. And I want to talk about this ABC in kind of a more simple way. Like we've been talking about ABC in terms of like Show and Tell Emrakul is AB. Show and Tell Omniscience Cast Emrakul becomes ABC, but now it's more powerful. It beats things that beat Show and Tell Emrakul. So you add a spell or you add a step to beat other things. We could take this all the way back to the bare bones, the most core part of Magic the Gathering's game engine. Colors. When you're a kid or new to the game and you're like, this is my green deck, now it's a Gruul deck, and you just cut half your forest and add that many mountains, that deck probably got a lot worse, even though your cards are a lot cooler. ABC, maybe even DE, we're talking about colors in your mana base, which also come at cost of maybe you get more powerful spells, but now you're more open to Wasteland, and also you might just not have the colors you need, even if you don't get Wastelanded, and now Blood Moon and back to basics. Like there's cost in just the most core of the game's engine as well.
Brian, I won't lie. I thought this was going to be an elaborate setup for AB. It's just Island plus Ponder, and then you never got there.
Well, that wasn't the joke, because that's not a joke. That's not to be laughed at. That's a very serious lifestyle.
Yeah. I think like talking about opportunity cost is really good with the Surveil lands. There is a very real opportunity cost of of playing ETB tapped lands in Legacy in this Wasteland Days format, but the benefits that you reap from playing these surveil lands are worth that opportunity cost for most decks. And like, my opinion of the surveil lands has only gone up the more that I have played with them, despite the opportunity cost that is associated with playing them.
For sure. And I am someone who plays fast combo decks, and I'm always looking for ways to fit more into my deck. And the big thing is, you have to think of how often you'll naturally draw one versus how often you will search one out using a fetch land. So you might play one in your deck, so your odds are, 1 of 60 to draw it reasonably. Or if you're playing 8 to 10 fetch lands, you now have a lot of looks at the surveil land. And if you fetch for it and don't surveil, that doesn't mean that this card was useless. And I've seen that come up in conversation as well. They're like, well, if you don't surveil, is it really good? It's like, yes, you had the choice there to put a card to your graveyard. And as someone who really likes winning, I want to make as many decisions as possible to help me achieve my strategy. This episode's all about opportunity costs. What are the costs of drawing a card that you don't want to draw? Pretty high, right? Like, you don't want to draw your Gaia's Will or your, I don't know, some other terrible card in Magic. But that's my point here, is having decisions is good and drawing bad cards is not good. So play surveil lands.
I'm not going to lie, that you saying that just kind of sent me into, just unlocked me. The idea that people are actually arguing that surveil lands might not be good because sometimes you don't put the card in the graveyard when you surveil.
That has been told to me.
I mean, I make that joke every time, but I assume it's understood that it's a joke, where I'm like, oh, it's like I didn't even surveil. It was there anyway. Or like I vamp tutor and the card I wanted was already on top of the deck. And I'm like, I wasted my life. But that's a joke. Like, thinking that is like, well, 30% of the time you'll just keep the card and then you just have a tap land. What the hell are they talking about? They need this episode.
Yeah, let's talk about drawing bad cards for a minute. So I today recorded with an Abdel Adrian Reanimator deck list that also played Show and Tell in the main deck. And when I made my intro, I went, Abdel Adrian is an A plus B. It's Animate Dead plus Abdel Adrian. That creates infinite tokens. And this is better than something like World Gorger Dragon, which was an A plus B plus C. And then I started recording the league. I kept running into things like, I have Entomb plus Show and Tell. Those don't do anything together. I have Show and Tell plus Abdel Adrian. That doesn't do anything together. And because my deck was like 4 reanimates, 4 animate deads, roughly 7 large creatures, 4 show and tells, there were so many combinations of cards that I drew where I had 4 or 5 cards in hand and I just couldn't do anything meaningful because the deck was trying to do so many things, and it was trying to be cute with Abdel Adrian, and it was trying to have this backup plan of show and tell, which didn't actually work with Abdel Adrian. And just all that I was thinking about was like, why am I not playing Riskaminator? Why am I doing this to myself?
I call that AB12 deck building, which I have been working with one of my patrons, Joe L, on the MTGO queues, who has this Reanimator Omnishow deck that he trophies with a couple times a week. He sends me every trophy he gets, and he and I have been talking about that deck and stuff for over a year now. He played it at Eternal Weekend. He has somehow found the sauce to make that work for him. That is exactly what I brought up many times in our early sessions, where it's AB12. Like, drawing Entomb and Show and Tell is not a dovetail that you want. If you draw a monster plus show and tell, that's good. If you draw Entomb plus reanimate, that's good. But sometimes you have A1 or B2 or B1, and AB and 1-2 are not in the same ecosystem. And you really need deck building ways to smooth that out so you don't end up drawing blanks.
I guess the last thing that I have to add here is that I find it really useful to look at ratios of cards when I'm thinking about the opportunity cost of deck building. And I want to go back to that blink deck that I mentioned earlier. So in my estimation, when I looked at the deck, this Bant blink deck that I was sent had 16 good things to blink and 26 blink effects. The things that were good to blink cost more mana on average than the blink spells. So like, the deck was just going to be passing the turn in the early turns. Turn 3 they play a creature and then they can start blinking it afterwards. If you're not interacting with your opponent in those early turns, your curve just is an absolute mess, and it's taking this many slots for your vision what are you doing? You've got to sit down and you've got to figure out, how am I going to fix this problem? How do I make these ratios more reasonable? How do I tighten up this package?
Right. Understanding what is enough is the key to this. It's easy to scryfall search and find a bunch of cards that say the words that you want, but then you have to cast them and you have to play against an opponent while you try to do that.
All right. So do we have any kind of closing thoughts on opportunity costs here?
Yeah, I just want to say, think about what you're not playing when you decide to play something. That's really all it is. You are not just putting a card in your deck that would be fun when you draw. You're excluding every other Magic card you could play. And think about the weight of that before you make that decision.